This is lecture 5 in International Human Rights. We'll call it Radical Evil / Banality of Evil. Radical comes from Latin radix, to cut to the roots of things. And the first area to cut to the roots of, which is essential both in human rights and political philosophy, is the question, what is the nature of human nature? What would lead people to do what they did in Yugoslavia, to lead people what they did in Rwanda, that would lead people to do what they did in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, in the Congo, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel to the Palestinians? What is it about human nature itself, when cut to the very roots and the depths of human nature, that out of that can come some of the very best of human aspiration and planning and building a better world, but also cutting to the roots of human nature, there is this tendency towards passivity, towards obedience, towards thinking of oneself, and at a certain point, groupism, herdism, by which people can commit terrible atrocities in the name of ethnic nationalism, of victimization, of protecting my own. And so at the center of human nature, as we reflect not only on history, but the present, there are two elements within humanity. One can lead toward the very best and the noblest, so there is radical good as well, but there is also radical evil, and as Plato rightly noted, there is the good and the bad horse, and depending on what, if the charioteer does not steer those horses, then the horses pull, and particularly the dark horse can pull the chariot of the individual, of families, of relationships, of nations, of international politics, to a destructive cliff's edge. So radical evil and radical good both dwell in the human soul and spirit, and historic events can draw forth one or the other, and it takes great courage, of course, in the midst of difficult political situations, for the deeper good to emerge. Often the price paid for it is rejection by people who, in the name of self-preservation or the ethnic or political group that has victimized them, they are now in power, they will victimize others. So radical evil, as we've looked at in our lectures thus far, and then the readings from the Massey Lectures in 217, both dwell in the human soul, mind, imagination, and much hinges on what a person will listen to in the midst of difficult situations. I mentioned earlier the Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials, in which the victors obviously tried Japan, they tried the Germans, but they themselves were not tried for crimes in terms of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the bombings of Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin by the British in World War II. So there's often this duplicity. In the early 1960s, obviously in the German context, the Jews, communists, gays, many others had felt the brutal arm of the National Socialists. The Jews obviously affected in a horrendous manner in the camps they were put in. By the early 1960s, even though the Cold War was going on, which in one sense hindered the ability to continue the Nuremberg, Tokyo traditions, both First and Second World liberal capitalist and communist engaging in their own ongoing through proxy states violations of human rights. Israel had become a state in 1948. And obviously, given what they had lived through, not only in the period of the 30s to 40s, but their history in terms of often being marginalized and seen as scapegoats in many European countries, there was the longing to have their own state in which never again would not only the Holocaust, but decades and centuries of marginalization occur. And so in the early 1960s, Adolf Eichmann, he managed to elude international law after World War II at the Nuremberg trials, but he was found and brought to trial in Jerusalem. And obviously for many, it was going to just simply be a trial, conviction, and it was just, the position was that once he had been through what seemed to be a formal process of trial, conviction, and death. Now, Hannah Arendt, very important political philosopher of the 20th century, she herself was a Jewess, a student of Martin Heidegger when in Germany. She was forced out, went on to do her PhD with Karl Jaspers on Augustine. Went to France, was for a time a part of the German underground, and then came to the United States. She became probably one of the most important political philosophers in the United States and elsewhere in the 20th century. But she attended the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem. And when one thinks of radical evil, the tendency is to think of someone almost with horns and a tail, vicious, violent, brutal. We've reflected a little bit on Yugoslavia and Milosevic. One can think of the Hutus and Tutsi and Rwanda. There are many stories, of course, that we could think about in terms of radical evil. For Hannah Arendt, what took her, as she watched Eichmann being tried, and who was responsible, not directly but indirectly through the chain of command, and just doing what he was told and asking no questions about the implications of what he was told in terms of the trains going to the camp. What took Hannah Arendt was this was a bland human being. This was a human being who did not want to think about what he was asked to do. He did not want to think about the consequences of giving orders on other people. He did not want to think about a chain of command. He did not want to think about why he is doing what he's doing and the tragic consequences of it. And Eichmann cared for his wife, cared for his children. In one sense, he seemed to be an upstanding person, cared for the pets they had at home. And so on the one hand, you have this person who is familially caring, concerned for family and other German families, and yet at a certain point just refuses to ask questions about what his country is doing, about the role he plays in the Holocaust. And in that sense, Arendt talked about the banality of evil. He was a bland human being who just did not want to engage himself, the state he lived in, what the country was doing, and he was quite content to be amused and entertained, provided well, a good house, fed well with the family, extended family. But beyond that, there were no more questions asked. And in that sense, Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil became a metaphor or a portal for women and men who live in historic contexts, but close their eyes to what's happening in the world. And all of their concerns is essentially amuse me, entertain me, pamper me, fatten me, give me my bread and circuses. And in that sense, they amuse themselves to death, but there's no substance to them as human beings. They're banal human beings. And so not that everyone obviously is an Eichmann, but for Hannah Arendt, Eichmann became a way of analyzing a form of evil that was not radical evil in the obvious sense of people aggressively engaged, as the Hutu did with the Tutsis, or aggressive people in Yugoslavia and Srebrenica, or many other areas in the world who were themselves explicitly engaged in violence or in death camps. But there is a subtler form of radical evil, and that is the banal human being who just refuses to think in a minimally meaningful way about the world that they're living in and the implications and suffering and tragedy of other people and how their state, or if they belong to a fairly affluent first world community, the role of their own communities in causing suffering to others. And in Hannah Arendt, it is these banal human beings that when we think radical evil, they're a version of radical evil which is more difficult to define because they're not so obviously engaged and explicitly so in terrorism, in violence, in evil, but by their silence, by their passivity, they in many ways legitimate and continue what people more aggressively at a formal political level, or as it were the stooges of those political level who just do what they're told, unthinkingly do. And it is these passive, bland human beings who just refuse to think about the world they're living in that contribute to the radical evil of those who are aggressively doing so. And so for someone like Hannah Arendt, how does one oppose radical evil, banality of evil? What is the role by which minimally human rights can be upheld, and who is responsible for these? And in the chapter we'll be reading, lecture 3, it's on Rwanda. And historically, through the United Nations, peacekeeping was seen as the means of resolving conflict. And what peacekeeping meant was that the UN would go into situations and broker some sort of stalemate between opposing forces. Now, Yugoslavia made it very obvious that, and in Rwanda itself, the mission headed up by General Dallaire, was that peacekeeping in which the peacekeepers had no access to arms, no means to protect not only themselves but others, was totally impotent in dealing with human rights violations. Out of that came in the early 1990s the whole notion of peacemaking, and that if peace was ever going to occur where violence and political civil rights were undermined, legal rights didn't exist, and aggressive violence dominated the day, there had to be stronger forces at work. And so peacemaking was a means by which finally the UN and NATO became engaged, in this case in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. It was too late, given the accelerated nature of the Hutu-Tutsi, particularly the Hutu going after the Tutsi. And so from out of this, peacekeeping traditions emerged, a much more militarized peacemaking tradition. And so in some sense, the transition in the 1990s from peacekeeping to peacemaking had a great deal to do with peacekeepers being much more active, much more engaged, entering the fray militarily to prevent worse military activism. And so what often seems a good peacekeeping was brought to the dock very clearly in the 1990s by the sheer inadequacy of peacekeeping forces, hence peacemaking. And so, to what degree was historic peacekeeping a form of banality of evil by which, given the context and the sheer inadequacy of the UN in engaging in Rwanda, facilitated that tragedy, and Congo as well, in which millions of people were killed through this period of time. So for Hannah Arendt, very clearly, overcoming radical evil, overcoming banality of evil, calls forth people at a variety of levels to engage politically and militarily in a way that is willing to use force to prevent human rights violations at a variety of levels. And without a greater force, the lesser force will continue to brutalize citizens. And so Hannah Arendt, obviously, and given what happened by the end of World War II, particularly with Canada, the United States, Britain, Europe, engaging Hitler, engaging Mussolini. It's too bad they didn't agree Franco as well, given some of the terrible situations in Guernica, in which Picasso did the great painting of the Basques. But for Hannah Arendt, then, how does one deal with radical evil on the one hand, and those who passively do nothing about it, or assume by peace keeping that somehow this will keep the hordes of evil, of radical evil, at bay? And for her, as she rightly came to see, is that you do need a strong commitment to a politics of the good and of justice. This is why Hannah Arendt became also not only Augustine in her grappling in her PhD, but became one of the leading scholars of classical thought. And how did classical thought deal with radical evil, banality of evil? In her work on Aristotle and many of these other great thinkers, in her work The Human Condition, is a breakthrough work. And so, and interestingly enough, one of her chapters is on forgiveness. And how do people who have been victimized, when they become power, not become themselves perpetuators and creators of other victims? And Arendt argued in her chapter on forgiveness, pointing out that those who have been victims, when they get power, must be careful they don't create other victims. And what is the role then of forgiveness? And often in political thought, how does one hold together forgiveness and justice in tension? But for Hannah Arendt, who is a Jew, she understood this also clearly. But in terms of radical evil, banality of evil, she certainly threw down the gauntlet in terms of how does one see through both of these twin-horned evils and overcome them to create a good, just, peaceful, and ecologically sane human rights agenda.